Hello, innovators, and welcome to another episode of the Jens Heitland Show, where I interview experts from different fields to connect the dots of innovation and entrepreneurship. Today's episode is another Innovation Breakfast Club episode, where I meet with previous guests to dig deeper into one specific topic. Today's topic is innovating for our grandchildren. Please welcome to the show Joshua, Jeff, and Stephen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next Innovation Breakfast Club. How are you doing?
Doing
How is
great.
everyone?
Well, good, thank you. I thought you were talking to the audience rather than us, but I'm great.
You're the audience.
You never know. You never know, Stephen. So on this, for those who are watching this live in the videos, I don't know if you can see that. I don't think you can see that in StreamYard. Hey, Jens, with the live in the background. So who knows? Maybe you're streaming this to thousands of people around the world, and we're going to catch Jeff on camera in Taiwan or something like that.
Yes. So we are very prepared for today's podcast with literally one sentence, and that's the topic of today. So we will explore innovate for our grandchildren. How do we innovate? Should we innovate? Do we innovate for our grandchildren? So what comes to your mind if you hear this? Who wants to start? I guess Jeff wants.
Sure, I can start. I remember I brought this up at the end of the last show we had, and to put it into context, it was a talk I gave at Shopify from a global event I created called World IA Day. Well, I didn't create it; I created it with a team through a community of practice on information architecture. And the theme of that year was called designing for good, essentially. So without getting into the details of the talk, because they don't matter, one of the ideas at the end was the concept of, instead of arguing over approaches and processes and disciplines, what if we threw away the personas in general and started looking at a world that no longer included any one of us? What if we started looking at moving away from the idea of arguing, which I define as, I'm going to make my point. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm not going to listen. I'm going to interrupt while you're talking to make my point because I don't care what you have to say. I think we're all familiar with that sort of experience, unfortunately, right? And instead, what if we decided to say, okay, I want to move to a point where I can debate ideas with people. And what I mean by that is, in order for me to debate with someone, I need to be able to argue as passionately for their point of view as I do for mine. So now I'm not arguing my point, I'm debating for the best idea. And so the idea behind designing for your grandchildren also spun into, this was 2018, so a year or two prior, all the generational stereotypes were coming up, the Karens and the millennials. And at the time of the talk, at the end, I prepared for a lot of different questions. I was giving a talk based on Mustafa Suleiman, who runs DeepMind, that was bought by Google for his artificial intelligence platform. He gave a talk at an RSA event about solving for the technologist dilemma. And there were 3 dilemmas. And so I had all these different answers for the 3 dilemmas he had faced. And I prepared for every answer except for this one. And ironically, it was a baby boomer that stood up and talked. They were clearly frustrated. And they said, with all these different things, how am I supposed to design for my grandchildren when the millennials need a trophy for showing up to work? And so I sort of looked at it and said, look, well, that's the whole premise of the idea of designing for our grandchildren. What if we stopped focusing on these generational things in a world that you can't perceive because you're not living that world at that time in history? And why don't we instead flip it around a little bit and say, okay, what if we're designing for a world and ideas that don't include us anymore? And so if we do that, perhaps we design ideas around how it's going to impact our grandchildren, which I think today speaks to a lot of people talking about things like the environment, sustainability, other things that are coming up. So it's the idea of basically removing ego and moving more towards an open construct that doesn't force you to sort of dig in to prove your point and demonstrate your impact and all these other things that are very hard to quantify in organizations today, and one that opens it up to a world of ideas and perspectives that many people sitting around the table or around a call like this may have not been able to consider otherwise. That was the general idea. So philosophically, it's interesting. I've done it with people in the past that couldn't define their personas. Be like, okay, well then we're designing for nobody here. But in my experience, it works quite well, because now it's not about ego, and it's about just sharing ideas, which potentially can build up to lead to better ideas in the future. That's it.
That's a start.
Okay.
Stephen.
It's interesting you raised remove egos in order to move forward, because I think that's what holds people back. Someone's always got to be right. And so if you can take that out of the equation, if you can say that, and you said it quite eloquently about being able to debate both sides of the fence, and being able to see somebody else's perspective, in not a confrontational way, but in a way that you respect their point of view. You do understand it. It's just you happen to disagree with it, right? Yep. If you can take the egos out of that, then that enables you to work together to find a solution that works for everybody. It's interesting, what you were saying. We're talking about, designing for our grandchildren, and I was looking at this from a far more of a kind of a humanitarian basis, rather than a technological basis. In terms of maybe we were having this business conversation before we came on, but let's say by removing payments out of the equation for businesses, that we are all working towards a common goal. Now, right now, that could be sustainability, global warming, the preservation of life, what with COVID and everything else that's going on. So if you kind of come at it from that perspective, but there are so many walls, there are so many barriers, there is so much political noise, that there are so many egos. And I want to keep coming back to that. You're right. How do we, it's such a mountain to climb, but at some point someone's got to take the first rung on the ladder. So it's interesting. I worry about the future for all kinds of reasons, the planet and sustainability. But you're right. When that person stood up and said, I'm designing something because someone wants a prize for getting up in the morning, then that's the generation that's supposed to be taking us forward.
Yep.
And unless old farts like us maybe stand up and go, hang on a sec, I think you've got this all wrong. We need to come at this from a totally different angle. Then, to be perfectly blunt, we might all be fucked.
Well, and I think, yes. And I think that's what the pandemic's shown. To me, it's like, there's certain things that just, we're all impacted by it. Whether you want to, the imaginary lines we've drawn in the dirt that are the borders that we've created over time that keep evolving and changing throughout history. They're just invisible lines. I've never seen a shot from space looking down planet Earth going, oh, look, there's the border between Canada and America. You don't see any of that, right? And if you look at the history of work itself, from the greatest generation to where the millennials are now, work itself from a labor perspective, the advancement of machines, technology in general, work used to be incredibly labor intensive, mostly from a physical point of view, and it's gotten easier and easier. So now we are moving closer and closer to the idea of always redefining work down to not necessarily being manual labor, not being that hard labor. So again, what my grandparents grew up doing, being farmers with no technology and very little, right, to where we are today, being surrounded by farmers, living on a farm and seeing all these massive, machines haying fields and doing things, what would normally take night and day efforts by farmers now are done in like a week, right? Spring and fall, they're haying the fields and they're planting corn at ridiculous rate. Like, work has gotten easier. So if you look at, again, if you don't start designing for your grandchildren, and or to your point, Stephen, around us old farts and whatnot, like understanding that generation's perspective and understanding we're never going to understand it because we aren't 25 anymore. We're not seeing the world through their eyes. And so it's so important. And from my point of view anyway, it's so important to try to ask better questions, right? It's, to me, it's how do you get to a better understanding if you aren't asking better questions? You can't get to better questions if you don't have a genuine interest in not trying to push your approach, process, or agenda, but trying to understand, okay, well, I don't know, I'm not an engineer. How do engineers solve problems? What is the problem you're facing now? What questions do you ask to solve that problem? Why would you take that tact? How is that going to impact your work down the line, right? Build relationships, understand that other point of view. So you don't have to push for your point of view. You are more genuinely perceived as someone that's interested in understanding a perspective that you can't grasp, because it's so easy to sit back and just the easy way out. I heard a comedian recently say, it's like, well, it's easy in this day and age to argue with someone, right? Or to agree with someone and go, well, that's what I heard. Right. And go, that's why I believe it. And if you want to do the counter of it, it's like, well, I didn't hear that. Right. So that's the easy way out. The hard thing to do, and the more effective thing to do over time, is to ask questions and to learn the other person's point of view. Because if you don't do that, or you just sit there and go, kids today, well, generations have been doing that forever. The world is always changing, right? So we're either open to the possibility or starting with the possibility that we're already wrong. We're already wrong, right? What if we started from that premise and then work towards an understanding of the fact that the world today, in hindsight tomorrow, is going to be completely different. So why are we digging into believing that we're absolutely right today, when tomorrow, a week, 2 years from now, we're going to look back going, well, that was ridiculous. Why the hell did I do that?
Let's give the word to Joshua as well, as the young thinker here. We could do this podcast even on the other podcast we're doing, but let's not. Maybe it's a cross. How do you say that?
Cross-pollination.
Cross-pollination,
Yeah. So I think, and the reason I've partly been keeping quiet is because I've just been processing and listening to all of the great points that Jeff and Stephen have raised, and there's a lot that's already been put down on the table, and I'll put a few thoughts together and string a few ideas into what I've been thinking about. So the first is really around this concept of the great stagnation. And those on the call and those listening may be familiar with Tyler Cowen and some of his work and that he's done from a thinking perspective. And inside of his book, The Great Stagnation, he talks about how much has really changed since the year 1970. And he uses the example of a sofa or a couch inside of a living room. And he says his parents in the 1960s, 1970s, they also had a couch. And in the 2000s, we also had couches, and we also had motorized vehicles driving around. And so how much has actually changed inside of this space? And are we at a state now where technology is becoming advanced? So Jeff, touching on some of the points that you were raising, are we at that stage where now there's the way that energy is output and the work that we are having to do means that we can now move out of this great stagnation that we're in, and we move into a realm of productivity where the work that we are doing and the energy that we're outlaying is allowing us to advance certain things technologically and things like that. And then the other thing is, Stephen, to tie into what you were mentioning about millennials, and you tied in well, I think, to Jeff's point right at the beginning about this concept or this award or reward for the millennial coming into the workplace and necessarily getting to work. And one of the things that I think about in this space is the concept of what is work and how do we define work? Because I think when we think about innovating for our grandchildren, we need to imagine a space that is different to the one that we're currently in. And yes, we can go and we do need to talk about and pay attention to the challenges and the problems that we face with regards to climate and sustainability and things like that. But what is the other side of the coin? Or what are the other opportunities and positive spaces that we can potentially look to? So one example that I'll use to illustrate this is a game called Axie Infinity. And Axie Infinity is now a game that's built on top of a blockchain. And that in itself is providing this space, these individuals, regardless of your age, an opportunity to do a different type of work. And so I think this very notion of what we grasp as work, what we grasp as the return on energy or the output of energy per se that we're putting into things is going to change over time. And that means that these spaces that we're creating and innovation environments that we are trying to imagine are going to be radically different to the ones that we know in the year 2021 in a couple of years' time.
We're deep today, man. Love it.
I think it's fair to say, right, that automation and advances and AI are going to mean we're going to have so much free time, free capacity that we how do we use that? So if we're innovating for our grandchildren and beyond, how are we innovating that we can fill that void, right? Because, and whether that's through learning new skills, Joshua, your point about being able to do different things, go out of your comfort zone, but not in a manual way, I guess, because we've got large machines cleaning fields and bringing in crops, and we've got robots building cars and moving technology on in that way. So how do we then fill that void of, we have all this free time? A job when I was growing up, when I was 10, was somebody physically going out the door at 7 o'clock in the morning and coming back at 6 o'clock at night. Yep. Going off to now, and that's changed in my lifetime. I'm a classic example of that. I work from home. I've worked from home for the last 15, 16 years. So we've got to be able to fill that whole void of how do we perceive work? You're absolutely right. What is the definition of work? And then what do we do to keep ourselves motivated, moving forward intellectually? Otherwise we'll end up doing what a lot of people do right now, scrolling through social medias, losing hours every day, watching other people's lives.
Yeah, so I think it's quite fascinating, Stephen, what you mentioned there. And I'll just throw in a quick quote to sort of create a segue and to sort of bridge that gap that you're speaking about. And it's a quote from Charles Kettering, and it says that a problem well stated is a problem half solved. And now if you think about that, and if we try and define this concept of work, and I find it quite interesting that we're centering around this concept of work, is because earlier today, Jens and I had a conversation around this association that people have to their realm of work and how that defines themselves as an individual, and the way that they talk about themselves and the way that they associate themselves to themselves, but also to the way that they position themselves inside of a work environment. And I think that that's fundamentally going to change in terms of how you go about defining yourself. And the reason for that is because I think, one, the workplace is going to change, but two is the amount of energy that we associate with the work that we do is going to shift, which means that we're going to have an energy space that needs to be occupied. And so if I can use an example to illustrate that, is the concept of, and Jeff, you mentioned it earlier in terms of let's use agriculture as an example. So when the agricultural revolution came about, there was a certain amount of work that was needed to be done, and that work required energy, and that energy was provided by humans inside of this space. Then that changed sort of when industrialization came about, and then the jobs sort of started to change, which means that people started to define themselves differently based on their role that they were filling inside of the society and things like that. Now, if you think about that for our grandchildren, how are our grandchildren going to associate themselves with what they need to do? And if you think about the way that starts, for me, where I start thinking about that, Stephen, to answer your question about this gap, this bridge that we need to fill, is it really comes back to education. Mm-hmm. So what is the role of educators to help people imagine what the future is going to look like? Because I think if you go back to the topic that we put down on the table, it says we're wanting to innovate for our grandchildren. So Jeff, you spoke about this talk in 2018, where you were at a conference with a lot of top minds and a lot of top thinkers, and you were speaking about design. And how do we go, where do we even start when we start thinking about designing for people who aren't even in the room? Is that based on just the diversity of the room itself, or is that based on an age gap that we're trying to fill?
Yeah, I mean, speaking to your point around value add with work, right? When you meet people, even before the pandemic and now, you start off with, "Hi, I'm Jeff." "Oh, hi, nice to meet you, Jeff. What do you do?" You frame your entire sense of self around your work and your job. And to your point, Josh, it's that idea of shifting that dynamic to what work is, our value around it. And again, looking at other cultures, right? In Scandinavia and Sweden and whatnot, they're not working 9 to 5 in every industry per se, right? You can, the idea is, well, you'll get your work done. And so if that means Wednesday you're going home at 1:30 to be with your family, okay, right? So there's also how do all different cultures approach and value work? I can't put a blanket statement across, how work works for everybody around the world, because every culture approaches work and their value towards it differently, right? How I value work as an entrepreneur growing up at the time in which I did, again, going back to this idea of designing for your grandchildren or building, or at least thinking about what the world that you're leaving to your grandchildren. No one can know. And if each generation takes that and says, okay, I'm designing for my grandchildren or building for my grandchildren, then, Joshua, you're 28.
Yeah.
So, your grandchildren, are 2 generations from you, whereas mine would be in the present day, like basically in the next, 10 to 15 years. Whereas a Gen Z, for example, who's 18 to 25, whatever the age range, well, that's 2 or 3 lifetimes away from them, right? Like that's a long generations, away from them. So it's shifting the way we think about work. It's shifting the way we consider what meaningful work is. It's again, this is a topic that is, there are no absolutes, and we live in a world of data and quantitative analysis where people want to feel comfortable. And the way that we get to a better place is to not be in positions where we're always comfortable. Again, the idea of talking to other people and learning from other people and acknowledging that you're probably wrong out of the gate, for me, has been really helpful, because what that does by asking questions is it also opens up people over time to admit that they don't even know the answer. Well, if you're all in the room and none of you have the absolute answer, but you have a preferred way of working and getting things done, then what is the common thing that's bringing us together? Is it not to create a better outcome for people? Is it not to create a better product, a better service? Is it not to feel valued in the work that we're doing, that I'm adding meaning? If I'm going to work 8 to 10 hours a day for a company, or as an entrepreneur, 12 to 15 hours a day, we all not want to feel like we're contributing and adding value? My father's best lesson in business that he taught me was that everyone wants to feel like what they're doing is of value, and that they're valued in the processes they undertake. And if you're a leader in any capacity and you can model that every day, that ultimately is it at the end of the day. If you can help that, you'll keep teams together. People will think differently. You'll model the behavior of debating by understanding, not arguing your point and digging in. But I think we have to get past this point of, well, you're going to demonstrate your value by how we can quantify your impact. That's ridiculous. That is just such nonsense. That doesn't keep people in work. That just goes, well, we have a measuring stick, and if you don't hit it. And one last final thought: there is an app going around out there with friends and colleagues of mine that work in these big companies, and the app's called Blind. And people are talking inside the companies about what it's like to work in different corporate cultures in these big companies. And I've been talking to them online in all these different companies. And the number one thing that comes up in almost all of the strings is people are bored. They are bored out of their mind. Their frustrations all can stem back to the point that they're just bored. They're doing one thing over and over and over and over and over again. They're bored out of their minds. So if that's where we're at, wow, we can do so much better, can't we? I don't know.
Can we not? Absolutely. I just want to dive in, Joshua. I know I can see you're eager to make a point, but there's 2 things I want to pick up on. First of all, Jeff, you're absolutely right. What you do doesn't define who you are.
No.
Absolutely not. And the minute people start realizing that, then the world's a better place, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Okay. You also said about meaningful work, and I think you're right that as humans, we want to see an outcome, right? It's just the way that we're wired, that we want to see progress, we want to see an outcome. But if we limit ourselves to what that outcome could be, then we will never get past that point. If that makes sense, I think this is as far as we can take it. Well, no, because you can take it so much further. The greatest invention going back several hundred years was the spinning jenny, right? And everybody at the start of the Industrial Revolution, and everybody was kind of like, and look where we are now. We have artificial intelligence and people predicting what we're going to see on screen and so on. So we're only limited by our own either our own beliefs or our own constraints. And I totally get what you're saying about people are bored in what they're doing, because either businesses aren't feeding them enough education or enough motivation for them to be just pushing the boundaries even further, or they're at a point where the business has gone as far as it can go anyway. So we're all now looking for something that's going to be better, and filling in that gap, is the challenge. That's what we should be innovating for. Joshua was absolutely right. Education.
Let's take us a little bit outside of the work environment. When I was thinking about the topic, I was thinking my daughter right now is close to getting 4 years old. Like, I need to design something for her kids, which might come maybe in 30 years from now. I mean, they're getting born, and then until they get 10, that's sure. 40 years from now. I most probably will be gone at that time. We never know. But it's if we just use this as a thought experiment and say, how could we use this way of thinking of innovating for our grandchildren in doing things and bringing our thoughts into a completely different mindset as a group? If we just dive a little deeper of how could we do that, rather than thinking about, oh, let's dive deeper into work, let's have a look on how could we utilize that as a possibility together to design and to innovate the future.
So he has a segue to try and do that. So there's a fascinating graph that I can't remember. It was a couple of weeks back, I think, where I saw it. So the question was around, where did you meet your partner? So your girlfriend, your boyfriend, depending which gender you are. And there's a fascinating graph that shows online versus in the office, and that can be correlated with the way that people interact. So the way and the amount of time that they've spent inside of a work environment and the rise of the corporation and things like that. And now when you think about that from a design perspective, and Jens, to bring that back to your point around how do we go about intentionally designing something for our grandchildren that we may never meet and may not be inside, definitely won't be in the room, perhaps, for that example. And where my mind goes when I think about that question is around the importance of designing for diversity, because we don't know what our grandchildren will value. We don't know what and how they will interact. We can imagine it, but we also have to design a space that can be interpreted and can be amended or appended depending on their needs, dreams, and desires. So how do we go about creating a world that is adaptable, in my mind, to allowing them to also figure it out, and to maybe bring that back to a sustainability standpoint, so that we haven't stuffed up the world so much that there's no world left to design for?
Yeah, I think the way to do that, I think it's interesting too, because I understand the importance of diversity, both from a historical perspective in terms of where we are, how we got to now, why we're at where we're at in the world in terms of being able to look at these things and the importance of them. But, in terms of looking at that, if we do a good job, is this going to be a subject that your grandchildren or your child, Jens, your daughter is going to need to tackle? Are we going to be able to get beyond that within a few generations or by her time? And are we not going to be able to be looking at other concepts, so other ideas that they're going to be able to solve, to your point, Joshua? So one of the things, I'm sure I'm stealing this from somebody, but I'm too old to remember where I'm stealing it from. But the idea is, when you're talking to the next generation or the people that your daughter, as she gets older, if we move the conversation away from what do you want to be when you grow up to what problems do you want to solve, and start asking questions in that way, because that shifts the conversation from what education do you need to what do you need to learn to solve that problem. So it's not about having to be an engineer. It's about, it could be about, I want to solve for the environment. Okay, well, then you need to learn about, maybe you need to learn a little meteorology. Maybe you need to learn science. You need to learn environmental studies. But then you dive into, well, I really want to protect wildlife. Okay, well, what do you need to learn to protect wildlife? What wildlife? Where? Now we're getting into critical thinking. I was looking up online before we got on this call, the top 10 courses, or the top courses that people are requesting on LinkedIn Learning this year. And 7 of the 10 courses revolved around either cognitive bias or strategic thinking or critical thinking. The top 10 didn't even include anything about artificial intelligence or machine learning. It was all about strategic thinking, critical thinking, and also, how do we deal with conflict, which makes sense with the time we're in.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm happy and saddened to see the fact that people are focused more on critical thought, right? And this is what most businesses don't do. It's harder to do, but it's also not. If you actually take the time to ask questions, and I think around education, we live in a world now where you can know anything, right? You just have to have the time and the space and the environment to be able to focus on what it is that you want to solve, and then find the people that you trust to be able to help you along that path. At this point in my career, I'm not at 48, with all the experiences I've had and the joy I've had and the opportunities that have been given to me and the things I've worked ridiculously hard for and the things I've sacrificed. I'm not here to prove myself to anybody anymore. I know who I am. I know what I want. I'm good. My job, my responsibility in modeling this idea of designing or building for our grandchildren is to help future generations get better. I don't want you to start by looking at things that have been solved for the last 10 years. You don't need to start there. Work from the premise that these things have already been solved. Now build from the construct of what you want to build and why. But don't make the same mistakes I did. And I think that's part of the problem as well. When you're starting out in your career, you want to prove yourself, you want to do all these things, you got a ton of energy, you want to make an impact. Where are you making an impact? And it's up to us, our generation, and the next ones behind us, to make sure that the ones behind them are asking better questions and deciding what problems they need to solve. Because now it's not about your title, it's not about your job per se. It's about a bigger meaning, a larger purpose, more important construct that you can sort of create a mental model around who you are and the work that you're doing. Because if you value the work that you're doing and you can see the outcome, as we've talked about, right? A lot of solving these bigger problems, you can actually see the outcomes. And technology comes and goes, right? People want portfolios for design and things you've done. And okay, well, if I'm going to show you stuff I did 10 years ago, it's going to look like I literally just put together a bad PowerPoint presentation and threw it over the wall. By comparison to the high devs, the 4K video constructs that people are stringing together and putting together by comparison. So is it about the outcome or the output? It shouldn't be about the output. It should be about the thought process. How did you get from here to there? How did you go about dealing with these things? There are no absolutes. We like to think there are, but there aren't. And I don't believe there are anyway.
So if you think about that, Jeff, and some of the thinking that you put down, and the word that pops to mind then is freedom. Freedom to explore, freedom to discover, freedom to iterate. And if you think about this concept, and Jens, to go back to your core question about designing this world or this space for your daughter or for our grandchildren, and what does that look like? How do we go about creating those freedom environments? And I think sometimes when we hear the word freedom, is that we can maybe associate that with sort of laziness or lack of work. And I think that that's an interesting concept, and maybe not a rabbit hole that we'll go down today. But if you think about that notion of freedom and that self-discovery element that can happen inside of that, how do you encourage that inside of people? And I, again, go back to this educational environment, and Jeff, you tied it all together very well with referencing the LinkedIn courses and where people are looking to learn and what skills they're looking to acquire. And it's almost where I go about thinking inside of the space is the relationship that we have to technology as people. So we all conversing, streaming today in different corners of the world, and we're just using it. We don't necessarily understand how the 4K video comes together, or why the stream is connected, or why our internet connection bombs out because the cable from America to South Africa, for example, has not been laid properly. but we're using it, and we all use this concept of JPEGs, and we shoot images across phones and through messages and things like that. We've got a sense of freedom. So what does that freedom look like if we now zoom in on this world that we're creating for our grandchildren that may be technologically centered, but also what if we unwind some of that technology and use it actually to work on bigger problems and really focus on how we're building out human connections?
I want to go back to this educational point, because I think this is like a real key aspect of that. Do you guys think that education at a much earlier stage in development of small children needs to be far more niche than it is right now? Rather than a real broad approach that like as you were saying, Jeff, what problem do you want to solve? Okay, so a much earlier stage, somebody goes down a biological route, or they go down a chemical route, or a physics route, or an engineering route. Does that then start to make people give them the freedom to expand the knowledge because they're really interested in it? Because to your point, Joshua, you're right. Freedom can be seen as laziness, but freedom, I think, it also opens up that I can go where I want to with this now. I'm not constrained by conventional thinking or conventional methods. So in stimulating that interest much earlier on in education, does that open up all kinds of possibilities? Because you're not then limited to, I don't know, 10 years of traditional education, if I can put it that way, that you could your mind can explore, and as we know, young minds are like sponges. They soak things up, and they become far more creative because they're not constrained by conventional thinking.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think most of what's being taught in the educational systems today, from say what we call kindergarten in North America through to I think it's grade 12 now in Canada anyway, is irrelevant. I don't need to know how to calculate what a hypotenuse right angle of a hypotenuse triangle is. I can't even believe I remembered that. I don't even know if that's a thing. I just threw that out there. But like, to that point, like the things I learned, is Shakespeare worth learning in English class? Not really. Like, again, you're asking kids who are 14 years old to learn English. I think Shakespeare had a vocabulary of something like 52,000 words. We're down to like 4,500. So, like it's ridiculous with respect to education. It's ridiculous for someone to read Shakespeare and go, at that age especially, and go, this is awesome. I can see it. This is incredible. You know how I learned Hamlet? I think Mel Gibson played Hamlet in a Hollywood movie, and I happened to have to read Hamlet at the time. So I watched the movie and then read the text and went, oh, okay, now I get it. But before, I wouldn't have understood it. And how has that helped me in my life? It may have enriched me in terms of thinking about things and, the complexity of the language. It's not helping me with anything today. And in fact, trades are the one area that we need more than anything, and no one's going into the trades. No one's going into, a lot of people aren't going into blue collar work. So again, I agree. I think if you position education as an opportunity to ask questions, to learn, I've thought for years, I was thinking about this back in university, because I hated university. I thought it was going to be a place to debate. It was just a place to tell the professors they were awesome and give them back the information they wanted to hear. And I'm like, once I learned that, it was a walk in the park. I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is easy. Here's your paper that proves your hypothesis. You're awesome. And I walked out of there with like a 98 average. It was stupid. But I always thought that it'd be wonderful. Imagine if you took kids, as an example, in grade 9. Now it's later than what you're proposing, Stephen, but imagine if you took kids in grade 9 going into high school going, okay, well, let's really focus on the things you're passionate about. Learn what you want, what you're really interested in, and then build curriculums and offer them the opportunities to learn about things around that. And then shape their career in high school around the things they want to learn, and have them, quote unquote, major in specific areas to get to the point where they can actually have a broader range of thinking, get them passionate about going to school and learning after the fact. Now you're setting up the next generation to go, I really need to solve these problems, and I love doing this. What do I need to learn more about? And now we're at a point in history where we have access to all the information. I think now it's more a matter of focusing and who to trust, right? Because everything's everywhere. Who do I believe? Why do I believe them? But if we set up an opportunity for them in the educational system and their parents, because again, they're going home. So how are you modeling that behavior with your children, putting responsibility on them as well? Saying this from the guy that has no kids, but putting that on them as well and going, all right, well, what problems do you want to solve? And encouraging that and supporting that development and mindset. Because again, it's to your point, it's too easy to sit on your phone and just scroll through your phone.
I'm not 100% sure if I would agree, because we need to disagree. No, we don't need to.
That's not what this is about. I'm right. Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's not what the show's about. I'm trying to lighten it up. This is a very serious conversation we're having today, gentlemen.
Right, so because for me, one thing is, I believe we need to create, you said, it's like we need to create a completely different educational system. 100% agree. What I have seen over time, because I've had the fortune of working with almost always more smarter people than I have been. In every position I've hired and worked with people from an educational perspective, at least like the grades and whatever. All of them have been smarter than I have been. But what I was missing was the human part in a lot of very, very smart people who have good education. So for me, it's like, how do we enable future generations to learn to think, to learn to learn, to learn to love, to learn to engage, and learn to motivate people? Like these things are not at all part of the educational system.
No.
I see this now, being back in Germany since last summer. They're teaching the same things they taught me in the 80s. To kids who are living in a completely different world, and the kids are completely disconnected from the topics they're learning, but as well they're isolating themselves inside the pandemic state now even more on the human aspect. And I'm missing that completely in all educational topics. Like, how do you motivate yourself? How do you think? How do you think critical to the topics you mentioned already? I think that's a huge missing piece where we need to look as well into, if we want to design something for our grandchildren. My daughter going to kindergarten right now, she needs to learn that already.
There was an Ivy. Sorry, Joshua. I did quick point, and then just to pick up on what you were saying, Jens, about that. There was an Ivy League university here in the States a couple of years back that had a course about social interaction. And it was the most oversubscribed course on the whole campus, so much so that they had to take it off campus to find a bigger building so they could get everybody into it. I'll try and find the details and share it with you, but that's something we don't teach children. And I think that's a huge gap in education. Sorry, Joshua, I just wanted to make that point. Back to you, sorry.
Not at all. I think it ties in well, Stephen, with some of the thinking that I was having while both Jeff and Jens were talking and putting down some of those challenges. And I think, Jens, to tie back to what you're mentioning, is I'll use an example inside of a story. So I went to school here in South Africa, and I went to the same school as my dad. And one of the teachers that I was taught by had been in the same educational institution for 18 years. And my dad there was a significant time frame between that. But the mere fact that that person had been in the same institution, teaching the same class for that period of time, does mean that there needs to be a certain amount of reinvention inside of that space. So then again, we come back to the educator, whose responsibility it is to design and to educate children of the future so that they can create and design better systems and a better world for us all. And now to tie that back to, Jeff, what you were saying around how we go about choosing what to study, and Stephen, it ties to your point as well. When I was at school, I picked my subjects when I had to choose subjects based on the teachers that I was going to be taught by. And the reason for doing that was because I thought, hell, I've got X number of hours to spend over a 3-year period. I better enjoy the teacher that's teaching me the subject, not the subject that I'm learning. And again, it came back to that human side of things. And so this is the thread, Jens, that I think ties it all together, and where my mind ends up when I start thinking about all of this stuff is around the concept of social capital. And we've found all of these different ways to value things. And, we valued precious metals that have come out of the ground that we've gone and mined. We value the amount of network speed that we've gone and created. We valued now intangible things on blockchains that we will only hold in pixelated form. We value pixelated art, and there's all these things that we value. But what's happened to this concept of social capital? And it's valued in terms of the way we think about networks and the way that we think about relations. But Stephen, to your point, it's not front and center in terms of when you go through an educational institution or early on in your environment, you're left to your own devices. You go and you put down in a sandpit at kindergarten, and you said, hey, these are 10 other kids that are the same age as you. Go on your merry way, go and interact. You're taught how to draw, but you're not necessarily taught about, hey, this is Stephen. This is how to interact. And I don't think that there's necessarily a way that we need to get taught about that. There's almost just like the space needs to be created. So, Jeff, it ties back to your point and the example that you used about university around, you thought you were going into this environment to debate and to challenge and things, but you quickly figured out, hey, this professor's got a thesis or an hypothesis on the way the world should be. I can go and validate that for them, and they'll pat me on the back and give me great grades.
Yeah.
And so how do we create this environment that embraces challenge and embraces freedom of thought?
Yeah. And what is the value? What is the value? Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No. I was going to say, it's no accident that, and I'm sure this is the same for you, that the subjects I did well in at school were the teachers that I enjoyed being with and I felt inspired me. The ones that didn't were the subjects that I tuned out of. And to your point, Jeff, about validation of a professor's thesis or whatever, if you'd have disagreed with him, you'd never have got into the club, right? And so we had to. It's the fact, And Joshua's right. There isn't. I don't think there's a way that you can say, okay, step one in how you develop this small child, step two in terms of social interaction, social capital. But if we're not even thinking about that, and maybe that is the thing that we should be thinking about for our grandchildren, how do you empower that social capital? How do you make that as worthwhile and as valuable as gold or network speed or saffron or money in the bank? How do you attach a value to that makes people go, I need to invest in that as an individual?
And education doesn't stop anymore. Stop and start with a degree, right? Education is now ongoing, right? Because in the past, we talk about the history of work. You got a degree. My dad got his master's in chemistry. He got in on the ground floor of a company, started in a lab, worked his way up to an executive during that time. And the ticket to getting into any job and getting a good paying job, because there weren't a lot of people with university education at that time, that was your ticket to success. That's how you got money. That doesn't exist anymore. The degree that I got isn't worth anything. In fact, when my background is in behavioral and cognitive psychology, I started working in a home with people with traumatic brain injuries who had violent behavioral and physical aggression and verbal aggression. And within the first day, I just took everything, all the theory, and I chucked it at the door. And I had to learn on the go. And that was the most valuable learning in helping those people take those steps, get to a better place, move out of that place, and get to a better place for them. And it was more than just the theory. There was so much more to it. The learning never stops. And especially today, you can go and get a degree in something, but Google's offering courses in design. Take our 6-month course on user experience. You can come and work at Google. So to the bigger point around education, what it is, how it's defined, how we define ourselves, the value we put behind the work and everything else, all of those things are up for question and up for debate. And again, I think going back to the point I was making earlier, we need to stop arguing with each other. We need to start understanding and asking better questions, asking more questions out of the gate. This concept isn't new. It just needs to be practiced a lot more. Instead of worrying about getting things done faster and better than everybody else, and everyone having a different measurement for better and impact and all these other, what I think anyway, are nonsensical, irrelevant constructs that are impacting people's mental health. I really think we just need to get back to the idea of asking better questions and being genuinely curious about how other people ask questions, how they approach problems, and being able to ask, what problems do we need to be solving now for the next generation? Because it's no longer what we're doing now is going to impact people 20 200 years from now. What we're doing now is going to impact literally our grandchildren.
So what you said there, Jeff, reminds me of a letter from the CEO of Patagonia, where she spoke about the year 2030. And I can't remember the exact year that she wrote that in, but I think that's a very powerful exercise to go about imagining and creating a space for what our grandchildren may inhabit rather. And I think one of the things that I certainly think about is this need to also create a space for them that allows them to discover who they are and what problem they want to solve. Because I think sometimes when we think about social constructs, behavioral constructs, even, is we all of a sudden you come out of the womb and you all of a sudden you're in this almost like this rat race. And again, that comes back to parents, and every culture is different. Every home environment is different. But I think it's almost like, what does that look like in terms of allowing that conversation to be had? Because again, we're talking about innovation, and innovation's a very bundled and a big term to deconstruct, but it's almost like you need to use lessons from innovation thinking when thinking about this space and this environment that we're wanting to create for people interaction and for learning environments going forward.
It's only through technology and social media that we've actually started having that conversation in the open, though, isn't it? Whether you follow mentors or innovators, we're only, I don't know, maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, I think, seeing that as being far more of a conversational topic everywhere, rather than it being in small in company offices or around the dinner table. And I think that opens up everybody now to start thinking about that. Well, live your life your way, right? Stop thinking about what other people think and focus on what it is that you want to achieve. But we don't teach people that. We grow up in a world where people's opinions either push us forward or hold us back. And if we could find a way to innovate that as a way of language is so powerful. Sorry, I'm all over the board with this because my mind's going in a million different directions. Language is so important when it comes to this. Jeff, you used the word arguing about a point, whereas somebody might use the point, well, I'm debating it or I'm deconstructing it. So language then becomes so powerful that when we use it properly, and I want to disagree with you about Shakespeare, because Shakespeare will always be relevant, right? Because because he's an English genius.
I was going to say, what are you dude, come on. You can't sit there. You need to switch to the American accent that you are supposed to be portraying living in Chicago right now.
No, I would never do that.
You can't demonstrate that bias, man. But anyway, go ahead.
But my point being is that there is a beauty in language.
Yes.
And you can articulate a point in a very different way just by the words that you use and the passion that comes out of those words. And I don't, unless you go to drama school, I don't know if anybody else teaches that.
Yeah. One important point on that, as the only one who is not native English speaking.
Really?
Being aware of that there are other people in the world that are not English speaking, and they don't see the differences if you use different words.
Absolutely.
Because I mean, I have lived in Russia. The English I spoke with the teams in the Russian organization or inside of Russia was different the English than I speak today, because you need to always speak in a way that they understand it culturally as well. Different words. If you just take debating and arguing and translate that into German, you will understand it differently than if you use it in English.
Yeah.
And that's I think very, very important to understand that as well. Well, we are as well need to understand making things simple in a way that people will understand. And if we talk globally, we need to consider there are different cultures who understand with the
Mm-hmm.
same thing different things. And if you consider, and that's to Jeff's point, is as well, we need to learn to ask the question. So what do you mean with that? So you're saying arguing and debating. What is the difference for you? And I think this, from a different culture perspective, understanding, oh, that means that in the culture. Sorry, I didn't mean that.
Yeah.
And starting this, and going back to education, I think that's also the part which is not taught today for young kids at all. It's like questioning and going deeper into like connecting all the different dots than just collecting. We're taught in collecting, like, hey, you need to get this grade, and to get this grade you need to do ABC and answer it in a way that it fits to the professor's idea.
So the way I've thought about that, an expression I've used through my career, starting especially in information architecture, where you're having to help people find things that's relevant to the audience, not to the organization, because a lot of organizations online still speak to their customers like they're the expert in the service they're looking for with the words that they use. I'm like, I have no idea what John Deere tractor I'm looking for. Why are you talking to me? It's the John Deere X300. Okay, I have no idea what the hell that means. Why are you labeling things like that? But the expression I've used throughout my career is that content is the king, but context is the kingdom. So right at the end of the day, and if you think it literally in terms of the kingdom, like the king and the queen sitting on their thrones, talking to their people, they can talk all they want in the terms they understand. But if the people they're talking to don't understand the meaning or the context, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter, right? And even, like experience and perspective. This is why I think it's individual and why critical thinking is so important, right? To your point around culture, Jens, right? Speaking, like I understand that what we're talking about is important. And I know the four of us have had some really great conversations. I enjoy your company. We joke around a lot before that nobody sees, right? About how we're making fun of each other and mocking each other and whatnot. And I'm sarcastic. And so, I also know that there are generations out there that I've met that, like, my generation is incredibly sarcastic, but the millennials and the Gen Zs take great offense to that I've talked to, because they don't understand sarcasm. And it's not that they don't understand it, it's that they find it to be cruel, some of them. And so my perspective can be, okay, lighten up. We're not curing cancer, calm down, right? But that comes across as being belligerent or off-putting. And I may think that's, come on. But at the end of the day, I have to be respectful of that and understand that the world they're seeing and that they've grown up in has been pretty harsh, right? A pandemic, recessions, not being able to socialize. We've talked about the ability to socialize with our friends, right? We are at a biological, not a psychological level. At a biological level, we are social creatures. We need interaction with other people to validate our worth and meaning and value in life. These aren't small, little, tiny ideas that you can just pop off and go, boom, we've created something and we're done. This has a global effect. And understanding culture, understanding how we describe things, right? Even within the debate circle, if you're literally someone that does debate, they literally label it as an argument. I'm arguing my point in the debate. So my definition of arguing versus debating is wrong within that circle of how I'm describing it. So I have to be very clear about how I'm describing arguing. I'm talking about it as a hostile act. I am arguing my point. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up, listen to me. Versus the ability to understand the other point of view so that I can debate back and forth the merits of it. But that's a two-sided thing. The other person I'm talking to has to have that understanding as well, such that we can get to that point. So what we're talking about, education, socialization, how work has evolved to become less intensive in every form, these aren't easy things to tackle, and it requires people to do much more work than they're doing. It is very easy in this day and age, politically, when you're looking at political, race, culture, all of these things, to just get pissed off about things. But understand too, you're seeing blips in time, right? Like even Jens, you're putting out these one moments of this minute of inspiration on some of these shows, and I think it's great. But at some points too, I mean, I imagine you have to be, and I know you're conscious of this because of the work that you do, but you also have to be careful about what you're doing, because if you aren't providing that 1 minute of a context, I know it's inspired to get people to watch the whole show, I get that. But are you providing that 1 minute of context that doesn't take it out of context to make people go, what? How is that a thing? Right? So it's always being conscious of all these little things and making sure you're not providing a blip in time. Just like when we design for the future generations, what is true today is not going to be true for them tomorrow. And that unknown may not be able to be answered, but the only way we get to a better state is to be able to ask better questions and to be able to have an intellectual, thoughtful, respectful conversation around things that we may not value or understand.
Can I add a caveat to that?
There you go, Stephen.
Sorry, but we need to have them in person. We physically need to have them. We don't need to have them through text or through email. We physically, either on Zoom calls or in person, have to have that, because I think that's a vital component to solving those problems and answering those questions. Sorry, Joshua.
So I'll disagree slightly with that, because I think that we have to move past that. And I think that we're going to have to move past that in order to solve those problems. Because if we keep defaulting back to that and saying the way to tackle challenging conversations or challenging exchanges is to have them in physical presence, we're never going to get past that, and we're never going to find a way to solve having those types of conversations online or digitally. And I think that that's one of the biggest spaces that, you know, a lot of people have tried to solve over the last 12 months in terms of allowing collaboration and things like that, which we've chatted about in different formats before. And I think that that's one thing that I'm certainly quite excited about, trying to almost deconstruct that, because I do believe that in order to move things and to accelerate things, if you think about people working in Singapore now, for example, versus what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan, how do you combine those two scenarios? How do you learn lessons from those? And to link that back now to language and what everyone's been saying, and to zoom in on the example that you put down, Stephen, around Shakespeare, I think that there are different ways that people can express themselves. So we may find now that Shakespeare may become not as relevant in more generations going forward, because people are finding different ways to express themselves. So if you take the NFT boom, for example, that has opened up a different way, a cultural expression of how people can express some of the work that they're doing. And I think that this digital environment, it's very convoluted, it's highly complex, but it doesn't mean that we can't learn from it. And I think that that's something that, you know, inside of this age where we are designing for our grandchildren or innovating for our grandchildren, we just need to be conscious of all of these constructs that have been that have maybe preceded their time, and that may inform some of the decisions that they take and make.
Yeah, but let's keep learning from each other, because at the end of the day, Simon Sinek in his golden circle of focusing on why didn't come up with the concept of focusing on why to begin with. That's the Socratic method from 2,400 years ago. So there are no original ideas in most cases. Most of the ideas have been thought of. So to what we were talking about earlier, if all of the ideas are out there, we just haven't heard of the original source, then why don't we focus on the problems to be solved? Regardless of whether we're in person, technology, whatever, do we need to not spend more time doing the work to share actual ideas and less time in 8 hours worth of meetings? Because we spend a lot of times in meetings in the office, and now we're spending a lot of times in meetings on Zoom calls. Why don't we spend more time actually doing the work and coming together and shifting the focus around the questions we're asking and how we're going to move forward together? You want to move faster? Great, move faster. But ask better questions up front, whether that's better questions at kindergarten, better questions at grade 9, better questions in the office. To me, it comes back to that, right? Why are we focusing time on specific things? And do we even have an agreement on why? The bigger problems to be solved today don't have to do with whether or not we're going to be able to make a slight modification on the next model of Ford car that we're rolling out the assembly line. It has to do with bigger constructs around how we as a global village are going to operate and create sustainability to be a real thing, not a theoretical construct. How are we going to get governments to get aligned and get greener technologies? And entrepreneurship and the true method of innovation is, I believe, ultimately how we're going to get there. We are going to get people to adopt and adapt to things more quickly. And that's going to be hard, but you know, anything worth doing is worth the struggle, at least in my mind and my experience. It's not going to be easy. You're not going to get a lot of people jumping on board with you, but doing the right thing isn't always necessarily the popular thing. And that's well, I'm not going to get into government. I'm going to leave that alone. Sorry.
And let's take this as the ending statement of today's podcast episode. We're already over an hour, and I really appreciate it. We could easily take another hour, but I would like to end the podcast episode with you guys right now, and maybe do another Innovation Breakfast Club call podcast episode, show, however we want to call that, at a future point in time. Thank you very much for the great discussion today. It was very deep. I hope the listeners and the people watching that got something out of it as well. I definitely got. I have 2 A4 pages of notes, and we'll dive deeper into them. Thank you very much, guys, and see you in the next Innovation Breakfast Club or somewhere else.
Great. Thanks very much, guys. All the best.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. You will find the links and resources in the show notes of this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, the most impactful thing you can do is subscribing to the show on any of the podcasting platforms and give me a review. This will help me to reach more innovators around the world and bring some of you into the show. If you have any questions to the guest or want to engage with me, feel free to reach out to me on social media and contact me there. Thanks, and see you in the next episode.